Before I could start the final assembly on the chassis, I first of course needed to prep and paint all of the parts. So they were cut out of the sprues, the mold lines were cleaned up a bit in some places where necessary, then they were all primed and painted in their various different colors. All of the main colors have now been applied with the airbrush, so I could move on to filling in some of the detail spots with a brush and some bellow paints. The engine and transmission had been painted with a brush in a pretty bright silver just to tone it down a bit, make it look a bit older and a bit fitting with the exhaust that I weathered a bit with some of the jet exhaust during the airbrushing. I just put on a light layer of Tamiya Panelline accent color. Now that all of the parts and pieces for the chassis had been painted and detailed, I could just start assembly on it. The chassis is now completed, the interior has been glued onto it, so I could move on to the final detailing on the body and finish this build off. As you know, with these BMWs there is lots of trim all around on the side, the bumpers front and rear, and also of course around the door and on the roof. That of course needs to be painted black to match the actual cars. Everything was carefully masked off and painted one by one. In order to make all of the lights and lenses pop out a bit more and look like the actual thing, there needs to be a reflective coating behind those lenses, in this case inside of the buckets. That was carefully applied with a brush, just doing 1 or 2 coats until it was nicely covered. During the prep work on the body before I started painting it, I scribed out the panel lines to make them a bit deeper and not disappear after a couple coats of paint. Now that all the paint has been applied, they are still nicely visible, and I wanted to give them a bit more depth by adding some Tamiya Panelline accent color. After going around the entire body with the accent color, all the panel lines have now been treated and the accent color had time to cure, and therefore I need to remove a couple of spots on where I applied it. I'm just using some Tamiya acrylic thinner to carefully remove it and not be too aggressive, applying it with a cotton swab and carefully wiping on top of it until it is gone. Now it is important to notice that this body has been clear coated, of course, and the clear coat is resistant to this thinner. Some normal paints without clear coat can easily be wiped off, and even acrylic paints can be wiped off with the acrylic thinner as well, so be aware of the surface you are removing it from and the material you're removing it with. So again, all of the detailing, the painting, and all the other stuff has been done to the body, so I could start assembling it all. With all lights and lenses now glued in place, I can add a couple coats of clear red to the rear taillights. Now the reason I glued them in first and started painting after is because this paint takes a while to dry, and I didn't really want to risk to put my thumbprint into it while pressing it in place. So by gluing it in place first and adding the clear coat on top of it, I don't really run the risk, as I'm not going to touch them anymore after this. So as you know, the body I'm using, of course, is not the stock 4-door version, it is the touring version. And the kit is for the stock 4-door version, so the windows won't fit. The front one does, but it needs to be modified a bit, so I need to cut the rear half off and just be left with the front. I'm scribing out the lines along that windshield in order to make it fit with a Panelline scriber until all the parts fall off. Then I sand it a bit gently around the edges to make it fit perfectly, and then I could start masking it off and painting the black border around it before gluing it in place. With the side windows from the kit, of course, cut off, I don't really have anything. Luckily, the trans kit from USCP does come with new windows. They made a nice mask in order to show you where it needs to be cut. I traced it onto the clear part itself and then carefully started cutting them out. With all of the windows now cut out and made to shape and fit, I could start gluing them in with some Super Gold Plus. With all of the windows now in place, the body and chassis could be married as well. The disc brakes were glued in place front and rear, and I created some spacers with a hole punch and some normal styrene sheet from a couple millimeters thick to space the rear wheels out a bit. The front wheels didn't really fit the way I wanted them to, so I again removed the disc brakes from the assembly, glued them on the inside of the wheel, and sanded the rear of that disc brake smooth so I could position it in the wheel well where I wanted it to myself. Now normally stock these wheels fit a bit too much on the front side of the wheel well, and I wanted to center it a bit more. This is normal with the M3 E36 version, but I don't really like the look of it, so I decided just to cut it off, lower it a bit, and also move it to the rear in order to fit more on the center of the wheel well. With all of the final parts, decals, and details now done, this build is finished.